Have you ever felt completely alone? Not just physically, but in a way that sinks into your bones, a suffocating loneliness that you can't escape no matter how far you run? That's how it felt after Emma died. Part of me went with her, leaving behind an empty shell of a man. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I got far enough away from the world, I could learn to live with that emptiness. So I packed up my gear and drove to the one place where I knew I could be truly alone. The woods near Coudersport, Pennsylvania. A remote stretch of wilderness, dense with towering trees, a silence that was almost palpable. I had been there once before, years ago, during a road trip with Emma. Back then, it had felt peaceful. Now it felt like the place where I was meant to disappear. First few days were quiet, almost too quiet. No phone, no internet, no human contact. Just the sounds of the forest. Birds, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant howl of some unseen animal. It should have been calming, but instead it felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. At night, that feeling only grew stronger. The darkness in those woods was different from anything I'd ever known. It was thick, oppressive, as if the trees themselves were swallowing the light. I would lie in my tent, listening to every creak and snap, telling myself it was just nature doing its thing. But there was something else out there. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, hidden in the blackness, watching, waiting. First time I heard it, I tried to ignore it. A loud crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by a strange, low whisper. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, but the whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started. I didn't sleep much that night. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside the tent, expecting to see some sign of an animal. There was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. Just the stillness of the woods and the fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. On the third day, I found the cabin. It was tucked away in a part of the forest I hadn't explored before, hidden beneath a canopy of gnarled trees. At first glance, it looked abandoned, but as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, and there were scratches on the wooden frame, deep gouges that looked too deliberate to be from an animal. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was musty, and the floor creaked beneath my boots. The place was empty, no furniture, no signs of life, but the walls were covered in faded photographs. Dozens of them, all nailed haphazardly into the wood. I moved closer, examining the photos. Most were too worn to make out, faces blurred by time, but one of them caught my eye. It was a picture of a woman standing in the woods, her back to the camera, her long dark hair falling down her back. My breath caught in my throat. It looked just like Emma. No, that was impossible. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of grief was clouding my mind. This was just a coincidence, just my mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared at the photo, the more certain I became that it wasn't a trick. That was Emma. I was sure of it. Panic set in. I stumbled out of the cabin, nearly tripping over the rotting steps as I rushed back to my campsite. I had to leave. Something was wrong with this place. I could feel it, creeping under my skin, digging into my mind. But as I hurried through the trees, the path seemed different, twisted. Familiar landmarks I had noted earlier were gone, replaced by an unending maze of trees and shadows. That's when I heard it again. The whispering. Only this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I froze. The whispering was right behind me. Soft, almost melodic, like a lullaby sung by something not quite human. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my legs refused to move. Jason. The voice was low, rasping, and it sent a chill down my spine. Jason, come back. No, it couldn't be her. My brain fought to rationalize it, to explain away what I was hearing, but there was no logic here. It was Emma's voice, or something that sounded horrifyingly like her. Slowly I turned around. My heart pounded in my ears, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The forest behind me was empty, just an endless sea of trees and shadows. But the whispering continued, circling me now, closer, more insistent. Jason, please, help me. Emma? I called out before I could stop myself, my voice trembling. Is that you? No response, just the wind rustling through the leaves, cold and indifferent. Felt like a fool. but the need to believe was stronger than my fear. I started walking again, faster this time, trying to shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. "Jason, don't leave me." The voice came again, louder, as if whatever was speaking was right beside me. I whipped my head to the side, but there was nothing there. Just trees, just darkness. "Stop," I shouted into the void, my voice cracking. "Stop playing with me." Laughter, soft, mocking laughter echoing from all around me. The kind of laughter that curdled your blood, that made you feel like a child in the presence of something far older and far more dangerous. Then I saw her. Figure standing between the trees, just beyond the reach of the fading light. Emma, or at least something that looked like her. She was wearing the same dress she had on the day she died. Pale blue sundress that had once been bright and full of life. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were empty. Black voids where there should have been warmth and light. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile that didn't belong to her. "Jason," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "I've been waiting for you." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the terror was all too real. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the air seemed to thicken around me, pressing in from all sides. What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Come back to me, Jason. You left me. You abandoned me." "I didn't," I cried, backing away. "Emma, I didn't, I swear." "Liar." Her voice suddenly shifted, becoming guttural, inhuman. The figure lunged toward me, moving with unnatural speed, and I turned and ran, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't know where I was going. The forest had turned into a labyrinth, the paths twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Every tree looked the same, every shadow a potential threat. I could still hear her behind me, that sickening laughter echoing through the woods, growing louder, closer. "Jason?" Her voice sang out, almost playful now. "Can't escape me." I didn't stop running until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out beneath me. When I finally stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. My campsite was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The woods were deathly quiet now, as if they too were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I had to be hallucinating, a result of grief, of stress, being alone for too long. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was here with me. Something that wore my wife's face, that whispered with her voice, but wasn't her, and it wanted me. "Jason." The whisper was closer now, just behind me. I whipped around and there she was, standing no more than a few feet away, her lifeless eyes locked on mine. That cruel smile stretched across her face, far too wide to be human. "You can't leave, Jason," she said, her voice soft but menacing. "We're together now, forever." I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, you're not her. You're not Emma." She laughed again, a horrible hollow sound that echoed through the trees. "But I am, in your mind, Jason, you always were." Then, I saw her. Figure standing between the trees, just beyond the reach of the fading light. Emma. Or at least, something that looked like her. She was wearing the same dress she had on the day she died, a pale blue sundress that had once been bright and full of life, but her face was wrong. Her eyes were empty, black voids where there should have been warmth and light. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile that didn't belong to her. "Jason," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "I've been waiting for you." Stumbled back, my mind reeling. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the terror was all too real. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the air seemed to thicken around me, pressing in from all sides. What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Come back to me, Jason. You left me. You abandoned me." "I didn't," cried, backing away. "Emma, I didn't, I swear." "Liar." Her voice suddenly shifted, becoming guttural, inhuman. The figure lunged toward me, moving with unnatural speed, and I turned and ran, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't know where I was going. Forest had turned into a labyrinth, paths twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Every tree looked the same, every shadow a potential threat. I could still hear her behind me, that sickening laughter echoing through the woods, growing louder, closer. "Jason," her voice sang out, almost playful now. "You can't escape me." I didn't stop running until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out beneath me. When I finally stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, I realized I had no idea where I was. My campsite was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The woods were deathly quiet now, as if they too were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. I had to be hallucinating, a result of grief, stress, of being alone for too long. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was here with me. Something that wore my wife's face, that whispered with her voice but wasn't her. And it wanted me. "Jason?" The whisper was closer now, just behind me. I whipped around, and there she was, standing no more than a few feet away, her lifeless eyes locked on mine. That cruel smile stretched across her face, far too wide to be human. "You can't leave, Jason," she said, her voice soft but menacing. "We're together now, forever." I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, you're not her. You're not Emma." She laughed again. Horrible hollow sound that echoed through the trees. "But I am. In your mind, Jason. You always were." I felt something cold brush against my arm, like icy fingers grazing my skin. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran again, desperate to get away, to escape whatever nightmare this was. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I could still hear her behind me, always just out of sight, always just close enough to make my skin crawl. And then, the whisper came again, this time right in my ear. "You can never leave." I don't know how long I ran. Time didn't make sense anymore. It was as if the woods had swallowed the hours, twisting them into something alien and wrong. My legs were numb, my throat raw from gasping for air. But no matter how far I went, the whispers followed. They slithered through the trees, curling around my mind and gnawing at my sanity. Every time I thought I had outrun them, it would creep back, closer, louder, more insistent. The sky above had turned an unnatural shade of gray, the kind that signaled no end to the darkness. There was no sun, no stars, just an endless suffocating gloom. The woods stretched on in every direction, a labyrinth of twisted trees and shifting shadows. Felt like I was running in circles, like the forest itself was alive and toying with me. Eventually, I collapsed against the trunk of a gnarled oak, my body trembling, my mind on the verge of breaking. I couldn't do this. I couldn't keep running. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I pressed them against my ears, trying to block out the whispers, trying to silence her voice. "Jason? Jason." The voice was everywhere now, filling the air, seeping into my thoughts. It was no longer a whisper. It was inside me, writhing in my skull, tearing at my memories. I shut my eyes tight, forcing the tears back, trying to remember anything that would anchor me to reality. I thought of Emma, her real smile, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the warmth of her touch. But those memories felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else, someone who had died with her. The Emma I loved was gone, and whatever was out there in the woods wasn't her. It couldn't be. "Jason, come home." Her voice echoed again, but this time it was different. Softer, almost pleading. It was close, so close, just behind the tree where I had collapsed. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest, and there she was, standing just a few feet away. Emma. She looked different now. The black voids of her eyes had softened into something more human, more familiar. Her pale skin seemed warmer, like the life had returned to her. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It was her. My Emma. Standing there, waiting for me, with that same look she used to give me when we were alone together. For just a heartbeat, the horror faded, replaced by a fleeting, desperate hope. "Jason," she whispered, stepping closer. Her hand reached out toward me, trembling. "Please, I need you." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe. God, I wanted to believe it was her, that somehow this nightmare could end and I could have her back. I started to reach out, my hand hovering in the air, inches from hers. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to close the gap. But then I saw it. A flicker of something behind her eyes, something dark and malevolent. Her smile twitched just for a second, too wide, too sharp. The illusion cracked, and I saw the truth beneath the surface. This wasn't Emma. It was a trap, and I was about to walk right into it. I pulled my hand back, stumbling to my feet, and her expression shifted instantly. The softness drained away, placed by cold, hard malice. Her lips curled into a snarl, and the void in her eyes returned, deeper and more horrifying than before. "You can't leave me, Jason," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You promised we'd be together forever." I backed away, my heart racing. "You're not her. You're not real." Her face twisted into something grotesque, something inhuman. The forest around us seemed to shudder, the trees bending unnaturally as if responding to her anger. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, like the earth itself was ready to swallow me whole. "Don't you love me, Jason?" She snarled, her voice warping into something monstrous, something that sent icy tendrils of fear shooting through my veins. "Don't you remember our vows? Till death do us part. But death isn't enough to keep us apart. Not here. Not in this place." I turned and ran again, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted through the twisted paths of the forest. The whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. They were in my head, crawling through my mind, distorting my thoughts. Every step felt heavier, like something was dragging me back, pulling me toward the darkness. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't let it take me. I didn't care what was waiting for me at the end of this nightmare. I had to keep moving, had to escape, had to survive. I ran until the world blurred around me, until the trees became indistinct shadows and the cold air burned in my lungs. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, every step heavier, as if something unseen was reaching up from the earth to drag me down. I could hear her behind me, that twisted version of Emma, the thing that wore her face like a mask. Her voice echoed through the woods, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't hide, Jason," she taunted, voice sickeningly sweet, mocking. "You belong here, with me." Branches clawed at my skin as I pushed through the thick underbrush, the sharp sting of pain a reminder that this was real, that I wasn't just lost in some horrific nightmare. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I could still feel her presence, closing in on me, like the shadows themselves were alive and hungry. The trees began to close in, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal hands, snagging my clothes, pulling me back. Forest was changing. Paths I thought I knew had twisted into something unrecognizable, a labyrinth of gnarled roots and tangled branches that seemed to shift with every step I took. Couldn't tell if it was real, or if my mind was finally fracturing under the weight of this impossible terror. Then, in the distance, through the suffocating darkness, I saw something. A light. Faint, flickering, but unmistakable. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, the promise of something other than this endless horror pulling me forward. My heart pounded in my chest as the light grew brighter, closer. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe it was a way out. I burst through the thick trees and stumbled into a clearing, nearly falling to my knees. The light was coming from an old lantern, hanging from a crooked wooden post in front of a small, dilapidated cabin. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same cabin, the one I'd found earlier, only now it looked different. There was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the wood itself was alive, breathing. And the light from the lantern flickered unnaturally, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the ground. I wanted to turn back, run in the opposite direction, but something compelled me forward. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the cabin, even as every instinct screamed at me to stop. The door was open, creaking on its hinges, and beyond it was only darkness, a deep, consuming black that seemed to swallow everything. I stood at the threshold, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't stay out here either. Not with her still out there, hunting me. As if in response to my hesitation, a whisper drifted from the darkness within. It wasn't her voice this time. It was deeper, colder, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Come inside, Jason." The air around me grew colder, and the forest behind me seemed to hold its breath. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there, but the trees were empty. For now, I had no choice. I had to go inside. There was no other way. Steeling myself, I stepped over the threshold and into the cabin. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of rot and decay. Felt like walking into a tomb, the walls closing in around me, pressing down on my chest. The door creaked shut behind me, sealing me in. The darkness was absolute, and for a moment I thought I had gone blind. Then slowly, my eyes adjusted, and I saw them. The photographs, the same ones from before, but now they were clearer, more vivid. They lined the walls, each one more disturbing than the last. Faces twisted in agony, eyes wide with terror, mouths frozen in silent screams, and in every one of them I saw her. Emma, or whatever was left of her. She was there in the photos, standing among the trees, her black eyes staring directly at the camera. In some of the pictures, she was closer, reaching out, her hands twisted into claws. In others, she was just a shadow, lurking in the background, watching, waiting. And then I saw it. The last photograph, pinned to the wall at eye level. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of me, standing in this very cabin, my face pale, my eyes hollow, my expression one of pure, unadulterated terror. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak of floorboards behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned around, my heart slamming against my ribs. She was there, standing in the doorway, her lifeless eyes locked on mine, that twisted smile stretching across her face. "You can't escape, Jason," she whispered, her voice like nails on glass. "This is where you belong." I stumbled back, my hand brushing against the wall, but there was no escape. Cabin had become a prison, the air thick with the stench of death, the walls closing in, suffocating me. And then, as she took another step closer, I realized something. This wasn't just a cabin. This wasn't just some haunted place in the woods. It was a trap for the lost, the broken, the desperate. And I had walked right into it. "Don't fight it, Jason," she whispered, her voice a sickening mockery of Emma's. "We're together now, forever." I backed into a corner, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. There was no way out, no escape. This was it. This was how it ended. Cabin seemed to shrink around me, the walls pressing in as if they were alive, pulsating with some dark, unseen force. The air was thick, heavy with decay, making every breath feel like I was inhaling something rotten, something that had been dead for a long time. Emma, or the thing pretending to be her, took another step forward. Her movements were wrong, jerky, like a puppet being pulled by strings. Her eyes, those black voids, bore into me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. Twisted smile on her face never faltered. Grotesque parody of the woman I once loved. "Don't be afraid, Jason," she whispered, her voice soft, almost soothing. But beneath that false warmth, there was something sharp, something predatory. "You've come so far. Why fight it now?" Couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy with fear. I pressed myself further into the corner, as if I could disappear into the walls, but there was no escape. The shadows seemed to pulse with malevolence, like they were waiting for her command to close in on me. "Look at what you've done, Jason," she continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "All this running, all this fear, it's pointless. You can't escape what you are. You can't escape me." I shook my head, trying to block out her words, trying to fight the rising tide of terror that threatened to drown me. The truth was sinking in. Deep down, I knew she was right. I couldn't run anymore. There was no way out of this nightmare. Her laughter echoed through the cabin, cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down my spine. She was close now, so close I could feel the chill radiating off her skin, smell the faint scent of earth and decay that clung to her. She reached out a hand, her fingers long and thin, unnaturally sharp at the tips. I recoiled, pressing harder against the wall. There was nowhere to go. The room felt alive with her presence, every creak and groan of the wood beneath me a reminder that this place was a trap, and I was its prey. "Jason," she whispered, her hand hovering inches from my face. "It's time to stop running, time to come home." Her fingers brushed against my cheek, and the cold that seeped into my skin was like nothing I had ever felt before. It wasn't just the chill of death. It was something deeper, something that felt like it was draining the life from me, pulling me into the void with her. "No," I shouted, slapping her hand away, desperation giving me a surge of strength. But as soon as I touched her, pain shot through my hand, a searing, burning agony that made me scream. I looked down and saw that where her fingers had touched me, my skin had turned black, like it was decaying from the inside out. She laughed again, that horrible, mocking sound, and I stumbled to the side, clutching my hand to my chest. The pain was unbearable, throbbing in time with my racing heart, but I couldn't stop. I had to move, had to get away from her. Fighting only makes it worse, Jason, she purred, stepping closer again. Her movements fluid and unnatural. Why do you resist? Don't you see? This is where you belong. With me. I staggered away from her, my mind racing. The walls of the cabin seemed to warp and twist around me, the shadows creeping closer, reaching for me with cold, skeletal hands. I had to do something. Anything. But what? How do you fight something that isn't real? Something that wears the face of the woman you loved but is nothing more than a hollow shell? Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A glint of metal, half buried in the dirt near the corner of the room. A knife, an old hunting knife, rusted and worn but still sharp enough to cut. I lunged for it, my fingers closing around the hilt just as she reached for me again. I turned, knife in hand, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear. Not for me, but for herself. Whatever she was, whatever had taken her form, it wasn't invincible. And maybe, just maybe, I could fight it. She paused, her smile faltering for the briefest moment. Jason, what are you doing? Her voice was softer now, almost pleading. But I didn't trust it. Not anymore. I'm not yours, I growled, gripping the knife tighter, ignoring the searing pain in my hand. You're not Emma. Her face twisted in anger, her eyes narrowing. The air in the cabin grew colder, the shadows pressing in from all sides. You think that little blade can save you? She hissed, her voice losing its warmth, turning dark and venomous. You can't fight this, Jason. Can't fight me. But I didn't have a choice. It was either fight or let this thing consume me, drag me down into whatever hell it came from. So, with a shout that was more fear than bravery, I lunged at her, the knife flashing in the dim light. She shrieked, a sound so inhuman it made my blood run cold. The blade sank into her flesh, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then she recoiled, stumbling back, her form flickering like a dying flame. Darkness around her pulsed, angry and writhing, but couldn't protect her now. Her face contorted in rage, her eyes burning with hatred. You can't escape me, Jason, she snarled, her voice a guttural growl. This isn't over. You're mine. You've always been mine. And then, she was gone. The shadows collapsed inward, the darkness retreating into the corners of the cabin. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving me standing there, alone, the knife still clutched in my trembling hand. But even as the silence settled around me, I knew this wasn't the end. Not really. Even though the cabin was silent, I could feel her presence lurking in the shadows, like a predator just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. My hand shook as I wiped the blood from the rusty knife onto my jeans. Blade had sliced through her, but she didn't bleed. Not like something real. Whatever she was, it wasn't human, and I had only wounded her, delayed the inevitable. My pulse pounded in my ears as I looked around the small, suffocating room. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with a strange energy, like the very essence of this place was alive and aware of me, watching me. I had to get out. I had to escape before she came back. I turned toward the door, but as I took a step, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and a terrible cracking sound filled the air. The wood beneath my feet splintered, and before I could react, the ground gave way. I fell through the floor, crashing into a dark, narrow space beneath the cabin. The knife slipped from my hand and clattered somewhere in the darkness. My ankle twisted painfully as I landed hard on the cold, damp earth below. I gasped, pain shooting up my leg, and struggled to my feet, the darkness closing in around me. My heart raced as I frantically patted the ground, searching for the knife. But all I felt were jagged rocks and damp soil. The smell down here was worse, pungent mix of decay and mold that clung to my skin. It was so dark I couldn't see my own hands, and the air was colder, colder than any place should be. Then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It echoed in the small space, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and strained to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, coming from somewhere deep in the shadows. My skin crawled with the certainty that I wasn't alone down here. I backed up slowly, trying to feel my way along the wall, but the space was too narrow, too confined. My ankle throbbed with every step, but I kept moving, desperate to find a way out. The scraping sound followed me, relentless, like something was crawling through the dirt, getting closer with every passing second. Then, a voice. Faint but unmistakable. Her voice. Jason. It was coming from beneath me, from the very earth itself. The ground seemed to tremble as her whisper grew louder, filling the small space with a bone-chilling echo. I felt my knees weaken as terror gripped me, my mind screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Jason, come to me. The voice was so close now, like she was right beneath my feet, buried in the dirt, clawing her way up toward me. I stumbled back, my hands scraping against the rough stone walls, and my foot hit something solid. I reached down, hoping it was the knife, but my fingers closed around something soft and cold. I recoiled, but then curiosity, morbid, horrible curiosity, made me reach out again, this time more slowly. I grasped the object, pulling it toward me, and felt a sickening wave of dread wash over me as I realized what it was. A hand. Cold, lifeless, and partially decomposed, the flesh slowing off in patches. I dropped it in horror, my stomach turning, and scrambled back, but my escape was cut short by the wall behind me. My back pressed against the rough stone, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. Her voice echoed in the darkness again, louder now, more insistent. Jason, don't you want to be with me? I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, my mind racing with panic. The hand had been real, tangible, but this was something more. I could feel her presence all around me, like she was part of the very earth. Like this place was an extension of her. She wasn't just in the cabin. She was in the ground, in the air, in the walls. Then suddenly, the earth beneath my feet shifted, and I felt something move. The ground rippled, a low, deep rumble vibrating through the floor. I looked down, and in the faint light filtering through the cracks in the cabin above, I saw it. The dirt was moving. Slowly, steadily, it began to part, like something was burrowing its way up from the depths. My heart raced as I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The walls pressed in on me, the air thick with the scent of rot, and I could hear her voice, so close now, whispering my name over and over again. Then, the ground split open, and something began to rise from the dirt. Figure, pale and twisted, its skin stretched tight over bone, its eyes black, hollow pits. It moved with unnatural grace, pulling itself free from the earth with long, bony fingers. And as it rose, I saw her face. Emma, or what was left of her. Her skin was gray and mottled, her hair hanging in tangled, dirty strands. Her eyes, those horrible black voids, locked onto mine, and that twisted, unnatural smile stretched across her decayed face. Jason, whispered, her voice soft and haunting, filled with an otherworldly hunger. Come with me. I backed up against the wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no escape. She was inches from me now, her cold, dead fingers reaching out, brushing against my skin. I could feel the chill of her touch, the icy grip of death pulling me down into the darkness with her. Join me, she whispered, her voice a sickening lullaby, soothing and terrifying all at once. We can be together, forever. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed with fear, trapped in this living nightmare, and as her fingers wrapped around my wrist, I knew I was lost. But then a sound, faint, growing louder. The creak of floorboards above me. Footsteps. Someone was here, someone real. I turned toward the sound, desperate, hopeful, and in that moment of distraction, her grip loosened. I wrenched my arm free and scrambled toward the opening in the floor, dragging myself up through the splintered wood and into the cabin above. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, and looked up, expecting to see whoever, or whatever, made those footsteps. The cabin was empty. I lay on the cabin floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. Cold air burned in my lungs as I forced myself to sit up, every nerve in my body screaming to get out, to run as far away from this nightmare as possible. But I couldn't move. Not yet. I had to understand. I had to know what was happening. The silence in the cabin was suffocating, thick and oppressive. Every creak of the old wood seemed amplified. Every rustle of wind through the broken windows sounded like a whisper in my ear. But there were no footsteps, no sign of anyone or anything else in the room. Had I imagined it? Footsteps, the presence? Was my mind finally snapping under the weight of all this terror? I pushed myself to my feet, wincing at the sharp pain in my twisted ankle. The room swayed around me as I steadied myself against the wall, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. The cabin was still the same. Everything felt different. Air was heavier, the darkness thicker, as if the very walls were watching me, waiting for me to make a move. And then I heard it again. Faint sound, almost too quiet to notice. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against wood. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the sound, my pulse racing in my ears. It was coming from beneath the floor. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and forced myself to move. Slowly, I limped across the room, each step a painful reminder of how fragile I was in the face of whatever haunted this place. The tapping grew louder as I approached the hole in the floor, the jagged edges of broken wood framing the darkness below, like the mouth of a waiting predator. I hesitated at the edge, my breath catching in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out before it was too late. But something pulled me closer. Morbid curiosity, a desperate need to know what was down there. I knelt by the opening, peering into the inky blackness. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence and the heavy weight of fear pressing down on me. But then, slowly, something began to emerge from the shadows. A hand, pale, skeletal, its fingers twisted and long, the nails cracked and blackened. It clawed at the edge of the hole, dragging itself up from the depths, and as it did, I saw her face again. Emma. That twisted, decayed version of her, pulling herself up from the darkness, her black eyes locked onto mine. "Jason," she rasped, her voice a guttural whisper, filled with an unnatural hunger. "You can't leave. You belong here, with me." I scrambled back, my heart pounding in my chest, but she kept coming, her body rising from the floor like something from a nightmare. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she knew there was no rush, no escape for me. "Jason," she whispered again, her voice echoing in my mind, drowning out my thoughts. "We can be together, forever." I turned and ran, limping toward the door, my twisted ankles screaming in protest. The cabin seemed to stretch out before me, the walls warping and twisting as if they were alive, as if they were trying to trap me inside. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air growing colder with every step until I could see it. My breath hanging in the air like mist. Behind me, I could hear it, crawling closer, the sound of her twisted limbs dragging across the floor, the sickening crack of bone and sinew as she moved. But I didn't look back. Couldn't. If I did, I knew I wouldn't survive. The door loomed ahead of me, so close, but with every step it seemed to pull further away, the room warping, stretching, as if the cabin itself was toying with me. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, and the walls seemed to close in, narrowing my path, forcing me toward the center of the room. And then, just as I reached the door, everything stopped. The air went still. The cabin was silent, the oppressive weight lifting for just a moment. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. Then, from behind me a voice. "Jason, you can't leave." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned around. She was standing there in the center of the room, her black eyes fixed on me, that twisted smile spreading across her decayed face. But she wasn't alone. Around her, rising from the floor, were others. Pale, twisted figures, their skin gray and rotting, their eyes hollow and dark. They crawled from the shadows, their hands clawing at the floorboards, dragging themselves up from the depths of the earth. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all of them staring at me with the same hungry, dead eyes. I backed up against the door, my hand fumbling for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. The wood was cold, unyielding, as if the cabin itself was sealing me in, trapping me with them. "You belong here, Jason," Emma whispered, her voice soft, almost comforting. "You've always belonged here." The figures began to move toward me, their limbs cracking and snapping with every step, their mouths opening in silent screams. I could feel the air grow colder, the walls pressing in, and my mind spiraled into panic. There was no way out, no escape. And then she was in front of me, her face inches from mine, her old breath brushing against my skin. "Join us," she whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. "Join us, forever." I screamed. My scream tore through the cabin, echoing in the thick, suffocating air. But it didn't matter. They were all around me now. Those dead, twisted things, their eyes black and empty, their mouths hanging open in silent, unnatural hunger. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaking under their weight as they closed in, their decayed fingers reaching out to pull me into their cold, dark embrace. I clawed at the door behind me, pounding on it with all the strength I had left, but it wouldn't budge. The wood was solid, as if the very structure of the cabin had come alive to trap me here, seal me in this nightmare forever. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing against me, the chill of their touch creeping up my spine, and my heart raced with the realization this was it. There was no escape. Jason, Emma's voice drifted through the dark, soft and almost tender, but twisted with a dark, cruel amusement. She stood at the center of the room, her black eyes gleaming with that inhuman hunger. "You're home now. You'll never be alone again." Her words slithered into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, suffocating any hope I had left. I could feel the darkness closing in, pressing against my skin, and the overwhelming sense that this was what she wanted all along. Break me, to bring me here, to make me one of them. Twisted figures drew closer, their decayed hands inches from my face. The cold of their presence was unbearable, the air thick with the stench of rot and death. My body trembled, my breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest, threatening to drown me. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With a surge of desperation, I shoved myself off the door and stumbled forward, pushing through the icy hands that clawed at me. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. Couldn't let them take me. I ran, limping through the cabin, past the decaying figures that seemed to appear from every shadow, every corner. The walls twisted and warped around me, the floor groaning under my weight, but I didn't stop. My only thought was escape, finding some way out, any way out. Then I saw it. A window. It was small, barely big enough for me to fit through, but it was my only chance. I bolted for it, shoving past the twisted figures that reached for me, their fingers brushing against my skin with a cold, deathly grip. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as I grabbed the edges of the window frame and hauled myself up, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle. Behind me, I could hear them closing in, their movements slow but relentless. Emma's voice echoed through the room, taunting, mocking, growing louder with every second. "You can't escape, Jason," she whispered, her voice sending shivers down my spine. "You'll always be mine?" I didn't look back. Couldn't. My hands fumbled with the latch, and finally, with a grunt of effort, I forced the window open. The cold night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness inside the cabin. I pulled myself through the narrow opening, my body scraping against the rough wood, and fell to the ground outside with a painful thud. For a moment, I lay there, gasping for breath, chill of the night air stinging my skin. The world outside felt different, clearer, sharper, as if I had been pulled from some deep, suffocating fog. But the cabin loomed behind me, dark and ominous. And ominous, its windows like hollow eyes watching me, waiting for me to return. I pushed myself to my feet, my entire body trembling with pain and exhaustion, and stumbled away from the cabin. The woods were thick and dark, trees casting long, twisted shadows in the moonlight. But I didn't care. I just had to get away, away from that cursed place, away from her. I could still hear her voice, faint but insistent, echoing through the trees, calling to me, whispering my name. The darkness seemed to pulse with her presence, like she was everywhere, in the air, in the earth, in my mind. "You can't run forever, Jason." Her voice drifted through the night, soft and taunting. "I'll find you, wherever you go." My legs felt like lead, my breaths ragged and uneven, but I didn't stop. I pushed through the underbrush, the branches clawing at my skin, the ground uneven beneath my feet. Every step was agony, but I kept moving, driven by the desperate need to get as far away from that place as possible. The forest felt endless, trees closing in around me, but eventually through the darkness I saw a faint light, flickering, distant but real. A small cabin, a different one. I stumbled toward it, hope rising in my chest, and pounded on the door. The light inside flickered, and after a moment, creaked open. An older man stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock at the sight of me, disheveled, bleeding, and desperate. "Please," I gasped, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Help me. Please." The man stared at me for a moment, his face lined with concern, then nodded slowly. He stepped aside, letting me inside, closed the door behind us. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a flicker of safety. A moment of reprieve. The warmth of the cabin, The soft glow of the fire felt real, solid, something I could hold on to. But as I sank into the chair by the fire, exhausted and broken, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the cabin felt too still, too quiet, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer than they should. And then the man spoke, his voice low and calm, but with a hint of something off. "You can rest now, Jason," he said, his back to me as he tended to the fire. "You've come home." My blood ran cold. The words, tone, it was all too familiar. I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest, and as he slowly turned around, I saw her face, twisted, decayed, that horrible, unnatural smile spreading across her lips. "Welcome home, Jason," Emma whispered, her voice echoing in my mind, filling the cabin with a sickening, cold laughter. "You'll never leave, never escape." I tried to scream. No sound came out. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in, the shadows swallowing the light, and I realized with a crushing certainty that I would never escape her. I was hers, forever. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. Decant.